right now I'm going to talk about reimagining education research impact. And I'm going to take a little bit of a different take because really some of the questions that I'm sort of thinking about right now and I'm grappling with, I'll be presenting to you, presenting in a sense my thinking in process and asking for your feedback through the sort of discussion groups that we will be having later. So I think, the key question that I'm really interested in right now is really what counts as education research impact. I mean, before we know what we can do, we need to know what counts. And then what are the factors that support education impact? And actually, really the last question, how do we develop an ecosystem that supports impactful education research? That's the main question I'm concerned with because, as a university that works closely with teachers, as an institution that works closely with teachers, we really do want to create that ecosystem where we can support the work that goes on. And when I was thinking about it, I think, it is important to contextualize our research and what we're doing in sort of the larger context of what is happening in the world right now. And the OECD trends shaping education bring up a few issues which many of you in this room will probably be concerned with and be familiar with. The idea of climate change and international polarization. That's something that's important, and we go back to values education when we think about that. The idea of well-being, right? Student well-being and sort of their mental health. But I think that's also tied to the idea of flourishing. We really want all our students to be able to flourish. Inequality in the education system, it exists in Singapore still. We do very well, I think, compared to many countries. I was speaking to Kristen, I think 59% of the New York population is on financial, but you don't use the word financial assistance, but students in poverty, that's more than 50% there. So, we have fewer, but the point is there is still a gap. That's not something to be patting our back about. And AI brings new possibilities. I was just speaking to a colleague and she used Perplexity to code our not very important research data, kind of just questions we were asking people. I was like, oh, that's so quick. That's wonderful. But at the same time, there are also new dangers. There are also new possibilities for kids to be further divided by what they know and do not know. And that's where I think the human is very important and the environment is very important. So it's in this broader context that we are situating that question. And it is not just an education question, it is a societal question. I mean, within Singapore itself, there are various changes, of course. At the school level, there is the Uplift program, which seeks to bridge students' learning. So, you look at community programs as well as school programs so that disadvantaged students get the help they need when they need it. We have moved into what is called full school-based banding. Everybody here will know, but it's the idea that there are many different pathways. We don't want to label students and send them to a stream and that's it for the rest of your life. But at least there are different pathways now that students can take. But at the same time, I just want to point out that for the kids who are in the integrated program schools, they don't get that same mix as well. So there are still inequalities that are happening. With moving into technology, kids are using personal learning devices at secondary school level, but there are also guidelines that are coming out. And I think what is really interesting with the MOH guidelines is that it is based on research, right? And we see a very clear example of policy and guidelines coming in place. And of course, with AI, we see the MOE ethics framework, it coming out in terms of AI, trying to grapple with it and deal with it now so that we can begin to think about it. And the fact that education is not just now, but it's really about lifelong learning. So we're talking about educating for a really long time, not just in our school. So formal, informal education is important. So that's kind of the educational context in which we're asking those questions. And, in grappling with this, we've looked at Lorraine and the team and myself, we looked at various definitions of what is research impact. And for today, I choose to use the UKRI definition, the demonstrable contribution that excellent research makes to society and the economy. I mean, it's something that you can see. It's often visible. You can see either attribution or contribution, but it is underpinned by excellent research. Okay, I think I can't underscore that enough, that research has to be excellent. It has to be good research. We know that you know, with the push to publish or perish, sometimes there have been folks, researchers who choose to falsify data, misquote, misuse, and that actually brings the research backwards. We think about, say, Alzheimer's disease, right? And false research that has gone out, and people build their research on that. But at the same time, during COVID-19, where people came together and research came very quickly, and we had the vaccines come out. And when I think back to history, many of you would be familiar with Florence Nightingale. We think about her as the nurse with the lamp tending, you know, the wounded sacrificially. But she was a statistician, okay? She looked at stats. And out there in the field, she counted what was happening. She took data, she collected the data, and then she made the data visible so that she could use the data to show people that a lot of the deaths out in the field were not from wounds, but were from preventable disease. And therefore, improving the hospitals, and that's kind of the outer circle there where you see all the preventable deaths in the yellow bit. Just improving, I mean, that's an argument for improving the hygiene of the hospital. And of course, we've got the long view now, we look at it, and that's where we are benefiting from that. I think it's really interesting because there wasn't social media then, but that was an example of visualization that really helped us to understand. But the visualization was actually based on data collection while out in the field. A little bit closer to today, Taylor and Sustin, that concept of nudge, which is the idea that, you know, the default option that you give to people actually helps them to make better decisions. I mean, that's probably too simplistic a summary, but basically in the idea of classical economics, what you have is all of us here are rational people. We'll make decisions that are optimal, but behavioral economists tell us we are not rational. I mean, why would I spend $1,400 on a new iPhone Pro just because I did a workshop where the photographer told me that's a good thing to have? But I did. I'm not rational, but these are decisions. And the interesting thing about nudge is that it has been implemented in public policy with our healthcare system, with our ERP systems, our public transport system. If you go Google Civil Service College, you will see the case studies on nudge. Finally, bring us closer to home. When we think about Wang Guangwu's work on overseas Chinese, I mean, we won't really think about that as applied research in the normal sense. But if you think about it, although it is conceptual, it is historical, it helps us to understand how the world works. It has informed the way we think, and it is content as well, because that is really to do with history and the present and the past and the future as well. So I just wanted to bring up those ideas for us to think about. So as I was working on this, one of the preliminary things that our team came up with was really to think about what counts as impact. And we have this impact documentation chart, which we started working on. And in that extreme right end, you'll see the word scholarship. And that's the impact that for both all of us working in the university, we are familiar with, because when you go up to tenure, people look at the publications you have, how often you're cited, what kind of keynotes you've been invited to. But when we think about impact, there is also policy and practice. And this is me putting on my teacher hat and kind of thinking, what can I do to help my colleagues see what other spaces they can have impact? On the top, you'll see policy influence, and some of the examples that I've given there are, for example, your work has been adopted, your framework has been adopted, your research article has been cited in a white paper, or you belong to some committee. Some of you here are on international committees, not just national committees. Under products, I've got curriculum materials, software, and maybe awards and recognition. I feel that certain things are missing, but that's what we have at the moment. In terms of engagement, we've got media engagement, where you kind of either write an opinion or you're written about, the project is written about in the press. Stakeholder activities, working with schools, speaking with schools, having partnerships, and even writing non-research publications that don't count for your tenure in some ways, but they are very useful for sharing the ideas. Infographics would fit into that category. We're having a little bit of a bind over here because we're asking, is engagement impact? or is engagement just engagement, and through engagement, there is impact? I'm not sure. I'm actually sitting on the side of the fence to say that if you bother to go to the school and you spend a lot of time talking to a lot of people, that's impact because your ideas are spread. Maybe you can't document it, but that in itself is some sort of impact. And because we are NIE, I think the education and capacity building bit is really important. We've got the staff development in terms of our researchers, in terms of our research assistants, but also particularly for pre-service education, training our teachers. There are programs integrating the research for graduate education. And I think more currently, the idea of professional development for teachers. We've always been doing that, but in what form? And I also want to broaden it to say, is it just for teachers, right? If we run a workshop on learning environments, is it just for teachers? If we run a workshop on literacy, is it just for teachers? Who are we building up? Who are we educating? Okay, so I'm going to use an example of each that's not scholarship because I think an example is helpful to kind of give us a sense of what things mean. So under engagement, I've used my own project, Designing Future-Ready School Libraries. And actually, if you look at this, actually in 2015, I was sitting in a school library and I kind of said, okay, we need to pay attention to school libraries because although we have a school library, which is really great in the Singapore context, they're not really attractive for our students to come into. And if we need to change our perception from why don't the students come into the school library to why should the students go into the school library? So that was the start of my journey. And I said, I'm giving myself 5 years for school libraries. 2015, it's 2025 this year. So I think that's about 10 years. I underestimated the amount of time that was needed. But if you look at kind of the projects that are here, there are 3 key projects, but in between there were smaller projects as well. But I want to highlight that the media engagement was quite important for me because I remember driving home after sitting in the library and realizing that was a problem and thinking, I know my MOE colleagues are convinced, my curriculum developers, my researchers are convinced, but how do I make sure that everybody gets to hear about it? Because it might not go all the way up. And that's why I felt writing in the press was really important. You need to do it to keep that sort of perspective and it's a way of educating people to say this is important. The other thing was the design patterns from school libraries. I was a former teacher, a secondary school teacher, and this is what I know about teachers. They're brilliant, they're very clever, they can do a lot of things on their own, but they don't have enough time. And because they don't have enough time, if you're able to curate and put things together, it will really help them with executing and thinking about what to do. So I pay attention to that. And there have been times where I said, I can't write this article because I'm working on this report. Never mind. What is important to me is getting this out. Finally, just doing workshops at schools and even having a website where the stories that we are featuring there are stories to inspire. They're not stories to tell you about my research. My research is on my own research page. But this website is for educators who want to find out more. And when we think about it from that perspective, we use their stories. So that's an example of engagement. An example of policy and practice influence. I think in the style of Darren, I have used someone's work and he's here. So Victor is over there. But, again, Victor didn't pay me anything as well. But I am kind of using it as an example with his work on multiliteracies. Those of you who know Victor's work will know that he's very well known in the field. I just saw you had 2 books out. I don't know how you do it, and various articles. But what I want to point out about the study itself is that he works quite closely with schools. He's in the field, so that's engagement. But he has also created materials, but these are curriculum materials. So remember we talked about influence on policy and influence on practice. So this is a creation of a product that can be used. But at the same time, what is also important to know is that Victor builds on a wealth of historical research at NIE that has been focusing on multiliteracies. Because when I was looking at the English language and literature research, we know that Phil Taldron, who is now retired in the 2000s, was already looking at that and they were doing research in that area. So I think there is the idea that there are many people who are building sort of the ecosystem where this kind of research that's important happens. And so, this is the kind of material where you see that practice influence. An example of education and capacity building, this is a bit of a different and very interesting kind of approach, because normally when we think about projects, we think this is my project, I did this, right? But Imelda, who works with us, I mean, she heads the school partnerships unit. Imelda's over there. She heads the school partnerships unit. And the interesting thing about the school partnerships unit is that the volunteers are researchers and they are volunteers. So they take time outside of their own research to actually organize this. And they've been working with the East Zone. So if you look in 2023 and 2024, and they've already started to organize the 2025 session. The sessions are organized in this way. They communicate with the zone. The zone tells them, we would like to hear research about assessment. We would like to hear research about, literature. And then they suggest the researchers. So this is 2024. They had one looking at computer supported collaborative argumentation, one looking at ethical literacy, one looking at mathematical thinking. And what happens after the presentation by the researchers is the educators who are there, the teacher leaders, they actually take the ideas, they run these little experiments in their classroom, and then they come back in August and they report on it. So you can see that this is an example of education and capacity building. The reason why I say it's education and capacity building and didn't put it under engagement is this, because I think even as we move into our system towards what our minister calls a pedagogy of one with the utilization of technology, the teacher's role at making choices in the classroom is even more important. You can't just give the technology to the student. You need to decide what kind of classroom you need to have, what kind of strategies to have in the classroom. So personalization is something that is even more important. And in order to do that, the educators themselves need to be able to use evidence and to evaluate evidence. So this is an example of the partnership. And I'm just going to give you a last example. And I think this example is so interesting because it is a very small grant, less than 20,000, a planning grant. And please excuse me, I'm using all the English examples because that's my previous department, and that's what I'm most familiar with at present. But my colleague, Christine Xavier, she had a small planning grant to look at English grammar in 2 classrooms. And she worked with the teachers on grammar and writing. So 4 schools, 10 teachers. And if you think about it, the research was the professional development, because as they were doing it, they were actually thinking, how do I improve my classroom? This is the intervention. She was training the teachers. And subsequently, after that, I mean, the research concluded, but she's still working with the schools and she's able to share with other schools. She's conducted professional development sessions, and her materials are integrated into pre- and in-service courses, not just hers, but other colleagues as well. And back again to the idea of the scholarship, she pressed on with the scholarship despite being a very busy lecturer as well. She's finished her book, she has 1 peer-reviewed journal, and she's done her talks, webinars, and conferences. So going back to sort of the definition of excellent scholarship, I think that's something that is really important. So remember, I started my session by asking 3 questions. What counts as education research impact? What are the factors that support education impact? And how do we support an ecosystem, develop an ecosystem that supports impactful education impact? Now you're going to expect me to give you the answer, and I'm going to say, I don't know. That's what we're going to figure out today. But I have given you a diagram, at least, with which to think about some of the things. And maybe I feel this is a more practical diagram. We're answering the how. The center part, the impact, we're still grappling with it on our end. But I think, I can give you some thoughts about what I think about research practice collaborations should look like. I think very often in the Singapore context, at least, that's very often a top-down approach. Actually, it's not a bad approach. When I think about Stella curriculum, I think not everybody in the room would be familiar, but this is the primary school curriculum and English curriculum. It's a very sound curriculum, but it was actually built over a period of time with projects, and then there was research, and then they scaled it up. So we've got very much of a scaling approach in the Singapore context. If something is good, we scale it to all the schools. And definitely there are things we need that kind of approach. But I think there's also room for a top-down and bottom-up approach where we need to understand what's important on the ground and let people have that flexibility to decide what is important. And in order to do that, at the top level, we need evidence. And the interesting thing is this, we need the evidence from the ground. It's not just our research evidence. We need to have our frameworks, we need to know our research, but we also need to know what is happening on the ground. So that's evidence from the ground. But from everybody else, who is involved, there's also a need to learn to rely on evidence and to read evidence and to use evidence critically. So that kind of top-down and bottom-up is something that I imagine would be very important, that our educators need to be able to do and our researchers need to be able to connect. So just my last slide on what are some implications for educators. I think the disciplinary rigor is still important. You're out there to teach a subject, math, science, English, whatever it is, you still need to have your basics. So that disciplinary rigor is important. It is something to focus on. But I think that educators actually need pedagogical flexibility, meaning I need to go into a classroom, read the classroom, and be able to plan what goes on. And different students might have slightly different needs. Okay, so that pedagogical flexibility is something that's important to focus on. And the last thing, and this is where I think what Darren talked about, researcher, stroke practitioner, evidence informed. How do we help our educators to be more evidence informed? Can we give evidence in a way that is more understandable? Or can we teach them to read evidence or help them to find evidence? For researchers, that's me and many people in this room, I think there needs to be a lot more contextual awareness. Sometimes we do our research in a vacuum and we don't spend enough time going down to talk to people on the ground. I say that I'm guilty of it myself sometimes because I don't have enough time, so I have to send my research assistants down to the ground instead of myself. But if they're down at the ground all the time, but not me, do I have that contextual awareness? Contextual awareness also means awareness of each other's work. I think we need a lot more methodological flexibility where we kind of ask ourselves, what do we need to get this kind of address this question? And we might need to say, okay, I'm a qualitative person, but I need a quant person to come in with me and work on it. And the last one I think is really important is the idea of communicative competence. I think researchers are generally just not very good. They're very good at talking, doing their research and speaking at conferences, but we're not very good at communicating with the other stakeholders. So that communicative competence, I think, is important. Last one, for policymakers, since we have some policymakers in this room as well, I think funding opportunities are important. I know with the ERFP grants, generally, there's always questions, discussion. It isn't the same thing all the time. So definitely funding opportunities are important. And, I'm just wondering about this idea. I put this idea of replication flexibility here because I kind of wonder, and this comes, I'm telling this little story, okay? So we were working with a school and they had put in a millennial innovation fund. The school put in a request for some money to innovate. And then when later schools tried to do it, they were told they said, oh, we were told it's no longer innovative because somebody else has done it. And actually it might happen other places as well. So I'm just wondering about, so I have this little question mark here, about innovation versus practice. Do we look at innovation in terms of big I and little I, big innovation, little innovation kind of stuff? And of course, finally, the training support in terms of for the entire ecosystem as well. So here are just my thoughts on this. And so thank you very much.